My name is Chelsea. I've hiked the same trails for the last 15 years, with nothing ever happening before. I'm still questioning if I accurately understood what I think I saw and heard. Last time I checked, Indiana is not a hotspot on the map for paranormal occurrences. One of the reasons why I felt safe over the years. I was with my boyfriend. We took our favorite trail. It was our favorite because it ended in a peak where we could watch the sunset with an unobstructed view. It was the perfect way to end our time together outdoors. The oxygen-rich air was always a consistent mood lift, and it made the tension of the week fall away, along with whatever difficulties we may have had with one another. We crested the top of the hill and stopped to catch our breath. The sunset did not disappoint. There were enough low-hanging clouds to catch the sky's fire. My boyfriend began massaging my shoulders. I always felt a little closer to him after a hike. I was starting to lose my balance when I saw him come up the hillside in front of me. He apologized, saying the wind has caught his cap. My blood ran cold as I connected the dots. If my boyfriend was right there in front of me, who was gripping my shoulders? I screamed and jumping forward, turning around to see who had invaded my personal space. There was nobody. I looked around, frantically. There was no way that they had gotten very far. As soon as I could see who they were, I was going to sick my boyfriend on them in a heartbeat. We were the only two people on the hill, and I tried to enjoy the rest of the night. I really did, but it was difficult. Somebody was rubbing my shoulders, and when I saw my boyfriend, the sensation persisted, so I knew it was not him. I've asked him if he saw anything when he came up the hill. He said that he did not. It even entered my mind that he was pulling a fast one over me with one of his friends. But he's not prone to devious behavior, and I can't think of anybody that would be bored enough for such a stunt. Besides, my boyfriend doesn't like anybody touching me but him. We still go out there, but it isn't the same, and my boyfriend hangs closer to me, even though he has never fully committed to believing my story. He respects my feelings more than he respects my account. Has anybody else had something like this happen to them? I was long overdue for some time on the lake with one of my favorite cousins. He was the brother that I always wanted, but never had. We stayed thick, well into our adult years. The ins and outs of raising families and making a living forced us into those long spells of silence. Of course, but when we finally reconnected, it was as if we never lost touch. It was a beautiful thing. We finally worked out a weekend where it would just be him and I out on a lake of our choice. Good fishing and good beer. We were both excited, and our wives even joked that they'd divorce us just so he and I could get married. He did look the way I remembered him, but he had a little more gray on his chin. There wasn't much silence, and we had plenty to catch up on. I had more or less resigned myself to the idea that we weren't going to catch on anything since we were talking so much. He was in the middle of a story about confronting his wife's brother for something when I caught a whiff of something terrible. My inner Sherlock Holmes was triggered. We weren't that close to shore where stagnant water would have a chance to waft in our direction. Then, I heard something that sounded like a fart. So I grimaced, and it was still terrible. But hey, we're guys. Being able to do that sort of thing without being henpecked was the whole point of getting out on the lake. So I didn't say anything. But my cousin looked around, asked what the awful smell was. I searched his face for any hint or inkling of irony or joking. I could tell he was serious. We both heard the sound, the one that sounded embarrassing. We could both tell it was not coming from either one of us. We both looked at the water, and I didn't see anything for several long seconds. But then, I saw something pulpy and long brushing the sides of our boat. I thought they were fish or snakes at first, but then one of them began feeling up the side of the boat. I was no marine biologist, but I know a tentacle when I see one. The part that made my heart start hammering was the fact that there was something like teeth on the underside of the tentacle, either for grasping or for tearing, or both. My cousin says that he never saw it, but I did, and that was enough to make me call it a day. I fired up the motor, and I swear the boat hesitated for a moment, as if in the grasp of something from underneath. But then we were free, and we made it back to safety. He still thinks I'm a little delusional. He doesn't know what I saw, but he's convinced that it wasn't just some unidentified sea monster. My eyes are just fine, and so is my judgment. I may not know what I saw either, but I swear that it was dangerous, and it was big enough to manhandle our entire boat. I had a horrible experience. One, when camping, that still freaks me out to this day. Nobody else saw it. Only me, despite the site being fairly full. But I believe it was real. I was with my family, my parents, and 3 much younger siblings. In another tent was my aunt, uncle, plus 2 younger cousins. I was the only teen. And still, I got on fine with everybody and was happy to muck in and help out. Because of this, they were happy to let me do my own thing sometimes and head off to try to find some kids closer to my age or join in the activities, or even just to chill on my own for a bit and some much needed quiet time away. It was on one of those evenings, having spent most of the day in the lake with the small fry, that I decided to head into the woods for some much needed alone time. Mainly, as I had overheard a couple of girls whispering about some possible late night skinny dipping. I knew there was a decent view of the lake from the trees. You gotta remember as I tell you this, it was the late 80s and I was 14, full of hormones, and yet to even kiss a girl. That sort of temptation was too hard to pass up. It was later then that I usually allowed to it as it got pretty dark. But I had been such a good big brother. They were letting me stay up later and later. I was just about to reach the spot in the trees where you could peek through and see the lake. I could already hear the girls splashing, when I heard something closer than the sounds of the girls. Much closer, like just a couple of trees over. The noise was like twigs and leaves crunching, alongside heavy panting. I admit, at first, I thought maybe it was another guy watching the girls, even though I was embarrassed and didn't want to get myself caught. My teenage curiosity got the better of me ultimately, and I needed to know who this other person was. I managed to get myself into an almost crouching position, stealthily moved across to see who had the same idea. What I saw, I will never forget. No, it wasn't a guy. Not even a person. I don't think it could have been a person. To start with, they were covered in hair. Now, since it was dark, I will always be grateful for that, as it did not see me. I didn't get the best look at it. How much I 100% remember, and how much I filled in with imagination, I don't know for certain. There was some light coming from the moon. That gave me just enough light to see this thing next to me, covered in dark hair. And then I also saw the wings. 2 large, scaly black wings close to its body. It was watching the girls, but it did not seem to be doing anything like I had been there. No, it appeared to be looking at them like with hunger, rather than lust. Its head was kind of like a bird, which would also account for the wings. But it looked hairy and scaly, not feathery, kind of like a man-sized bird thing, with a humanish face, with a sort of hooked beak for a nose. That's the best I can do, because then it let out this humongous scream, and it screeched right back at me, and then flew up into the air, as if somebody had a bungee cord on it. I think I probably fainted, as the next thing I remember is being woken up by some concerned-looking workers from the camp, and my dad carrying me back. I didn't tell them the whole truth about why I had been there. I said that I'd be getting some fresh air when I had heard some strange noises, and went to investigate. I told them that I had found a strange man standing there, watching the girls, and had screamed to alert them. I was deemed a hero. The police took a statement and did a search, but, of course, they found nothing, other than some really odd footprints close to where they had found mine, which did not make much sense, as they seemed to have claw marks. I own horses, and have been around them since I was a kid, and am extremely confident and competent with them. In many ways, I prefer the company of them to people. You always know where they are with a horse. I have a huge ranch, and as well as my own, I stable others. It's a decent enough way to make a living, and the owners all trust me implicitly. I have had rescues and ex-race horses that I've rehabbed, and even a mare who had been severely abused. She had to be kept all on her own, away from the others, and wouldn't let any man near her. Only me and one other female could come into her stable without all hell breaking loose. And since she is so vulnerable, God help anyone who provoked her. They'd be fired on the spot, and if she gave them a swift parting kick, so be it. So when I woke up one night to hear a hell of a commotion going on down there, I was furious. Who was upsetting my babies? They sounded scared, panicked, and most of all, I could hear the mare going absolutely crazy. When she came to me, her legs were injured from trying to kick down the stable wall to get away from her abuser. Since she was safe with me, there had been no further incidents of her getting injured. But now, I recognized that terrified whimper and the sound of a body being thrown up against the wall. Something had spooked them, but her bad enough to set off her old injuries if she did not stop trying to ram the wall. I grabbed my shotgun, raced out to see what was out there. At that point, I wasn't thinking about my own safety, whether there might have been a wolf or bear out there waiting for a meal. Besides, I was armed, but all I was really concerned about were the horses, and specifically my mare. I sped to the stables and immediately saw what was causing the chaos. Something was standing right outside the mare's stall. Something I had never seen before. It was quite small, possibly around 5 feet, and squat, like it was as round as it was tall. I have absolutely no idea what it was, but if you were to put the gun to my head and say what was your gut feeling, I would say goblin. A goblin? That's nuts, right? But that's the only thing I could think of as I looked at this grotesque-looking thing. It was naked and had a pale pinkish skin tone. It looked to be completely bald, and it was fat and round, and it had these droopy layers of flesh covering up any private bits. The reason it made me think of a goblin was mainly its face, which was all screwed up and very pointy and sharp-featured. It even had these awful sharp bat-like ears sticking out. It was completely fixated on the mare, who was still going nuts and trying to break out. I quickly fired a shot into the air, a warning. This thing turned slowly, looked at me face on. I was very glad those extra rolls of fat. It held up one clawed hand, and I could see long pointy fingers. Then, it stuck out its enormous tongue, in an almost leering fashion, just before I could get another shot off. It appeared to vanish. The very second it seemed to disappear into thin air, the atmosphere changed again, and all the horses, even the mare, seemed to calm back down. I stayed with them for another hour, checking all around the stalls and the perimeter of the ranch, but nothing. I never saw that vile creature ever again after that, and I still haven't since this happened. I was washing my fillet knife in a creek when my girlfriend cried out in the distance. She had said something about investigating a beehive she thought she had seen from a distance and was going for a little honey hunting adventure. I came running. It's a good thing I did, because if I'd been any further away, I might not have heard her screaming turn muffled. Something stood over my girlfriend. Something humanoid. It had dry-looking gray skin that revealed the movement of every single muscle fiber and tendon. If that wasn't bad enough, in place of a face, it had a mass of feelers like a sea thing, and they were completely engulfing my girlfriend's face and lifting her up off the ground. It looked like it was trying to swallow her head first. I panicked. Her oxygen was going to run out. So time was not on my side. I had almost forgotten my fillet knife, and I thanked God that I had it on me. I flew at the creature to stab it in its side. I expected it to just slide right in, and then I would twist it. It was like stabbing a sack of concrete. The knife went in, but it met with a lot of resistance. This thing didn't cry out, twitch, or anything. A whole new wave of urgency swept through me. I began stabbing wherever I could. At the shoulder blades, the spinal column, at the base of the neck. This thing just kept sucking on my girlfriend's face, who whimpered pitifully as she began to lose consciousness. I tried the feelers in desperation. Finally, there was a reaction. The monster flinched, swung at me, causing a few more tendrils to come loose. This tested my bravery, since its sensitive point was in its face, where I'd have to confront it. The knife found more dull matter in its stomach, so I made another lunge at the feelers. It didn't like it. I got raked with those claws, which were more like long old lady fingernails. Something about that was more frightening than it should have been. Didn't change the fact that I loved my girlfriend. Another swipe at the feelers showed that it had a ring of eyes under the first ring of feelers, and that's where I jabbed. That's what got the thing to let go of my girlfriend's face. I got a second wind and stabbed at it as many of those tiny eyes as I could. Its scream was wet and ugly, like it wasn't made for breathing the air. It fell backwards, and I stumbled, landed on top of it, I got ready for more strikes, but the claws slashed across my face in 3 lightning-quick strokes. The world turned upside down, and it was gone. I must have blacked out. I woke up in a hospital. EMTs told me that my girlfriend phoned 911 and gotten me to care, which told me all I really cared about, which was that she's okay. I was more than a little upset that she told them nothing more than I had been attacked by a mountain lion. There was going to be so many inconsistencies in that account. She thought that what really happened would be beyond believing, and she did not want to get mistaken for being a mad woman and put away. I still owed her for getting me to emergency services, so I couldn't be too mad. Man, things are really crazy when you look back on these kind of situations. This was back in 1995, and I haven't looked back since. I was a crewman on a road crew here in Illinois, around the neighborhood of Bement. When you're not from Illinois, the term middle of nowhere seems to apply to the entire state. But when you're around someplace like Bement, then you're in the middle of nowhere. The location wasn't just rural. The location was just plain empty. There was the road. There was us, the crew, and there was grass and corn. That's it. We were working on, you guessed it, a road. And we were coming up on an older bridge that would need to be included in the project. But there would need to be an inspection first. I told one of my crewmates to make sure that the thing wasn't going to collapse, and also to check that there weren't any wild animals or vagrants underneath the bridge before we began our work. Wild animals were more likely. No homeless person in the right mind was going to be camping out in a location that remote. Not unless they were a serial killer. I should have gone looking for him when he was taking too long, but I got handed a piping cup of coffee, and didn't think anything of letting my crewmate take his time. I'm ashamed to say that I kind of forgot about him. One of the other guys came looking for him, and I told him that he was under the bridge, making an inspection before we began work on the bridge. So, he too went under the bridge. He also did not come back up. I didn't notice, though, until I put my nose into my coffee for another sip, and I smelled something really harsh. I stood at attention, looking into my cup. That's when I noticed the smell wasn't coming from my coffee. It was coming from somewhere around me. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach, and I realized that it was coming from under the bridge. Whatever it was upwind of me. I tried not to look as urgent as I felt. I saw tall grasses and scrubby weeds. I saw the shadows hugging the corners where the ground and concrete met. Then, I saw the faintest red lights. It was overcast, so it was easy to pick out. For a moment, I thought that I had seen evil red eyes, but then I realized they were just embers. I smelt something burning, a combination of burning cloth and perhaps human hair, the horrible odor that I had thought was coming from my coffee. In short, because it messes me up to tell this part, I found the 2 bodies of my workmates. They looked like they had been incinerated, and they were 2 masses of cinders waiting for a breeze to blow them away. I don't remember much after that. My crew told me that I screamed out loud, and everybody came running and saw me with the 2 bodies. The account was so far-fetched that law enforcement went over the case with a fine-toothed comb, being slow to believe that the 2 burnt corpses were who I said they were. But there weren't any alternative explanations. Somehow, My men had been flash cooked on the spot. I was a prime suspect, sure, but nobody could explain how I could do such a thing. People don't realize how non-combustible the human body is, and those two were burnt all the way to the core. Another reason identification was delayed. They didn't fire me like I thought they would, but it did not take long for me to resign. Every day that I showed up, I felt like I could have done something more to keep my men from getting incinerated. I'm disgusted by coffee, even though I'm still addicted to it. This life has turned very ugly. I can't bear to live and can't do anything to die. I'm hoping somebody out there will reach out and tell me they've heard of anything remotely like this happening. I decided to take some time off from work and head out to a cabin that I had inherited in Tennessee. I don't care what the stereotype of a city businessman is. If I don't get back to nature at some point, well, I snap. I could tell that point was coming up, so I dropped everything, delegated what I could, and said screw the rest. I was off to my cabin. It was warmer weather, so the shade of the pines was welcoming and comforting. At the time, I had found it reassuring that the nearest road was over a mile away. I would soon find this to be a huge setback. I also didn't pay much as attention as I should have to the peculiar growths that had formed on the side of the cabin. It was all along the bottom, near the ground. Some sort of fungus, but it wasn't black mold, so I wasn't worried. I settled in, not fully realizing just how exhausted I was until I had stopped moving. I left a good deal of the stuff out in my truck, but I did not care. I was so far off the beaten path that no criminal was going to work that hard to rob me. I'd get everything else the next day. Before I knew it, I was out. I awoke to the sensation of being tied up. It almost made sense that my one break that I get from work is the time that somebody chooses to ambush me. But I wasn't tied with ropes. I was anchored down by something ropey and slimy and cold. It formed a webbing over me, like it had grown over me while I was asleep. My imagination ran wild, and I imagined that I had been cocooned by giant spiders. But no, I wasn't hanging from the ceiling. I was in bed, where I had fallen asleep, just webbed over by some strange pale pinkish blue fibers that were much stronger than they looked to be. If I had been any weaker, I'd still be on that bed. I tore the weave of strange fibers off me, kicked them down, and I swear I saw some of them writhing a little. I looked around, noticed that the entire bedroom had some traces of the fibers, like they had grown all over while I was asleep. I didn't think that I'd been out that long, but it was pretty dark in the cabin. I looked around, noticed that there were chinks of daylight peeking through a mass of fibers that had overgrown the window from the outside. My heart began to beat faster as I ran to the front door and tried to open it, but it was sealed shut. Those strange fibers had even grown in the space between the door and the jamb, so the door wasn't even wiggling in place. I tried to calm myself, sat down at the breakfast table to think for a moment. The fibers were there too. I eyed the fibers clinging to the table, more like I watched the contact point between the table and the fibers. There was definitive movement. It was very slow, faster than a houseplant, but slower than a snail, and it was moving in my direction. I was just as fascinated as I was horrified. I did try to maintain a rational approach and decided to call 911. I found that my phone had been the things among left outside. My saving grace was a wood axe that I had brought inside years back. I took that old beater, and I began scraping at the scummy fibers, clogging everything, trying to avoid the door if I could help it. Well, it couldn't be helped. Even after demolishing the door, there was a solid web of the fibers on the other side, but they weren't a match for the old axe. I eventually got to my phone, called 911, and told them about what had happened, that they should send some sort of wildlife patrol. Well, you'd never believe me, but not only did I get an ambulance, I got a full black sedan of men in dark suits. The EMT crew was a little more forceful than I had expected them to be. They had all but stated that I was going to be with them, whether I liked it or not. When I got to leave the hospital, my car and all my belongings were waiting for me outside, but I was informed that the cabin was entirely demolished and essentially removed from existence. The strangest thing I have ever had happen in my life. I had been driving all over the county. It was dark, and I was tired. Thankfully, my wife was with me, chatting and keeping me awake. We'd been delivering care packages to members of our families who at the time were unable to get to the stores and needed to stay inside due to COVID. I was exhausted. The black coffee I had been inhaling for the last couple of hours was the only thing keeping my eyes from closing. Thank God my wife was chatting away and keeping watch of the road ahead, as it was her scream that allowed me to ram my foot on the brake as this creature ran out in front of us. Despite having my headlights on full beam, I wasn't able to get a great look at it, mainly because I didn't know what the hell it was. It shot across our path like a blur, then seemed to stand stock still in a daze at the sight of the car. In just those short seconds, between catching sight of it and slamming the brakes on, it looked the size of a bear in height, yet also really skinny, like it was starving. It seemed to have an overly large head as it stared at the car, and we saw two huge white eyes and what looked like a large circular mouth. Then, slam, I hit it. I hadn't wanted to, and I hope you believe that. I am the type of man who will catch a bug in the house and release it outside, even though I had no idea what this was. I had tried to brake in time. The force of the impact caused the creature to slam off the hood of the car, but luckily we were fine, except for being shocked. I made to open my door, to go check on it, but my wife gave me that, "Didn't you see that thing? We need to get out of here now, look." So I swerved around the lump in the road, and we headed home in silence. I could not stop thinking about the creature, though. Not only what was it, but had I killed it? I had to go back and check. The following morning, I drove back to the same spot where I'd hit it, driving up and down the road, as I wasn't sure of the exact spot. And then I saw the blood. Lots of blood. I felt awful. Since there was no obvious sign of the animal, I decided to get out and have a look. When I examined the blood, it was even more strange. There was some gray, fleshy-looking lumps, and also feathers. Feathers seemed to make less and less sense of what I had already seen. The blood trail seemed to cross over towards the woods, on the opposite side of the road. I walked over, looking through the trees. I could see blood right up until one extremely large tree. Then it appeared to just disappear, as if the creature had climbed up the tree which made no sense. I drove up and down the road several more times over the following few weeks, going actively out of my way to try and find that creature. I was driving myself and my wife mad. I Googled and searched for hours, but I could not find anything to match what we had seen. I guess I'll never know what it was if it had survived. I come from a hunting family. Hunting buddies. We have dogs that are used to coming out with us. They are brave, loyal, and fierce. In all the times I've been out with people and the dogs, they have never let us down. They would die to protect us, and probably enjoy the fight, which is what makes this story so much more weird. We were out as usual one evening. The dogs were riled up and ready to go. We had picked up a very decent trail, and they were following the scent for us. There were 3 of us. 3 dudes, all longtime hunters. 5 dogs between us, all experienced. One male in particular, a real mean pit bull, literally bred to hunt and fight, had taken the lead, all fired up over what they could smell. All of a sudden, we heard a noise. Not unusual, of course. Would have been weirder not to hear anything. Only this was like nothing any of us have ever heard. 3 guys with years of experience between us, and we all looked at each other like, what was that? The dogs all stopped too, like something out of a cartoon, where the dog stops still and acts like a pointer. Even the big brave Pit, who had been snarling and gagging for something to rip apart, went quiet. We did the typical guy thing of trying to make light of it, laughing, making noises and laughing. The kind of thing you do when you're scared but you don't want anybody else to know, so you act the fool instead. Then, all 5 dogs began howling too, but unlike us, real low long howls, as if they were answering some unknown force. They didn't sound like they were ferocious beasts. They sounded like they were showing their subservience. It was eerie. We called to them, but they wouldn't budge. The hound, who I'd seen rip out the throat of a large buck once, lay on the floor exposing his belly. Okay, something was going on. Then, we heard the noise again, and this time it made my blood run cold. Despite the many layers, I felt chilled and something I had not experienced in a long time out here. Fear. Usually, I am pumped full of excitement and adrenaline. I know, between the mutts and my shotgun, I'm safe against anything the woods has to offer. But right at that moment, I honestly didn't feel like I would get out of there alive. We hadn't even seen anything yet, just heard the sound. You may notice I haven't actually told you what the sound was. That is because it was almost impossible for me to describe. But if I had to, I would say the best comparison would be the mix between a wolf howl and the screech of a bird of prey, like an eagle. And then, it stepped out of the woods, as I said. Until then, the big brave had been howling and showing how submissive they were. Now, having seen this thing better than us, with their eyes being used to the dark, they went into a full-on panicked frenzy mode, whining, whimpering, crying. One just started pooping everywhere. Another actually made a run for it, and we heard it trying to head back towards the truck. Now, if I thought describing the noise was hard, then trying to tell you what we saw, it's almost impossible. Mainly because we had never seen anything like it. and I was honestly beginning to wonder if I was somehow hallucinating. If the other guys and the dogs hadn't had the same reaction. Because what was standing by the trees was something like out of a horror movie. Big, tall, mean-looking. It wasn't big body-wise, but it looked like its body was stretched. Really long arms that almost touched the ground, but short legs in comparison. The torso was way out of proportion. It appeared to be, from what we could tell, covered in dark gray hair, although it looked patchy in places, like dead skin or mange. Its hands and feet were huge, and again, looked totally out of place with how skinny it was. This all led up to the face, that in some hellish way looked somewhat human. I say somewhat. The features were like that, like the shape of the mouth, nose, and eyes, although they were all distorted and stretched across the enormous skull. This was almost oval in shape rather than round. It appeared to have no fear of us or the dogs whatsoever, and I'll admit, I just wanted to haul out right there. But Trigger Happy Petey decided to offload a few hundred bullets into that thing. Okay, well, maybe not 100+ bullets, but more than I could count. It just stood there. I don't know whether those bullets went through it, or just did not penetrate the skin, but the thing stood there and took it, and I did not see a speck of blood or any sign of tissue damage. That was it. I had no issues if they called me a wimp. I was gone. Turns out they were right behind me, dogs and all. We jumped in the truck and hightailed it back home. We've talked and talked about just what the thing could have been. I reckon it was at least 8 foot tall, so I can't see any way in hell it could have been a human. Even if it was one of those hillbilly Deliverance or Melonhead types. So I'm asking you, what in God's name did we see that day?